thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you in this beautiful city. It is a tough act to follow with our previous speakers. It's also a tough time to talk about free speech in an age of rage with the assassination of Charlie Kirk in my country. I knew Charlie well, and it was a shock for many of us. They just arrested the shooter not long ago, which will bring some perhaps closure to his wife and 2 children, but I doubt it. But it unfortunately is apropos of what we're here to talk about. I wrote this book. It was basically 30 years in the making. I had a very difficult time giving it up to Simon & Schuster until the editor showed up at my house and explained that in order for people to read the book, he actually has to publish it. And so I finally gave up the ghost. But the reason it took me so long is that I didn't want to write just another free speech book. What concerned me was that we're still struggling with free speech, not just in the United States, but around the world. We've never really resolved what free speech is. We tend to deal with the insular cases and the insular conflicts of free speech. But we find ourselves on this slippery slope, unable to resolve anything except the immediate conflicts that occur. The title of this book should resonate with the people in this room because it came from an opinion written by Louis Brandeis, who ultimately came from family here in Prague. And he was a descendant of Czech grandparents. He was also arguably the most brilliant justice ever to sit on the Supreme Court. And he was a great champion of civil liberties. And that's what drew me to this title, because it comes from a case in which Brandeis wrote beautifully about the freedom of speech and how it's the indispensable right upon which all other rights depend. And he did so in a concurrence in which he upheld the conviction of a woman for speaking against lynchings. Now, that conflict, that rather glaring conflict, did not seem to deter one of the greatest civil libertarians in history. But it shows the problem with which this book addresses, that the reason Brandeis could write so beautifully about free speech and yet send someone to jail for using it is that there still was not, and still is not today, a true resolution of what free speech is. This book actually argues what may be, which is clearly a minority view in the United States and in some parts of Europe, and that is that the freedom of speech is a natural right, that it belongs to human beings regardless of their country. It was not created by any government. It was not bestowed by any society. It existed before society. It existed in the state of nature. That view of natural rights was very prominent among the framers of the U.S. Constitution, who relied a great deal on John Locke. And the interesting thing about Locke is he talked about certain rights that came from God, including a right to property that existed before there was any social contract, before any departure from the state of nature. And the framers were heavily influenced by John Locke when they articulated our own freedom of speech in the Bill of Rights. When I teach freedom of speech to my students, I often talk about this picture in the Sistine Chapel, and specifically about one aspect of it. Of course, this is the panel of God creates Adam. And specifically, I asked them about what the touch means. This is one part of a painting that has probably launched more PhDs than any picture in history. And people debate, what is the touch? And of course, one could easily conclude that the touch is, after all, the panelist's name, God creates Adam, that it is the spark of life, that it is the creation of life. It's not a very convincing argument, though. Adam is already fully formed, and it seems like there's more going on there than just the fact that someone was created. And the question I raised to them is, what if it has another meaning? And as obviously, we can all bring different meanings to this subject. I was drawn, in looking at this book, to a rather obscure article that appeared in a European journal from a doctor who was a neuroscientist. And he went to go see the Vatican and went back and asked his wife, "Did you see what I saw?" And she said, "What?" And he said, "This. Why is God superimposed over the human brain?" And he said, that is remarkably close to the human brain. It seems like an odd accident. After all, we do know that Michelangelo used to dissect bodies in order to be a better artist. And he asked, well, why would he do that? And it's a very good question. So what could possibly be, if this is not a coincidence, in Michelangelo's mind? Now, one possibility is you could say that Michelangelo was sticking the finger in the eye of the Pope, making a secular statement about humanism. It's not very convincing because there's no other evidence in the Sistine Chapel of any such motivation or hidden meanings. I have my own rather bizarre, perhaps, theory about this that, not surprisingly, comes back to free speech. And the question is, that I pose is, what if that touch meant something about what was being created? That in fact, we talk about man being created in God's image. What if God was creating another creator? That's what's the unique aspect about humanity, is that they have a need to create. When I teach this subject, I walk around my classroom and wait till I find a student that's doodling. I don't know if there's a Czech term for doodling. It is when you randomly write sort of anything on a piece of paper. Usually people do it without thinking. Usually people do a series of geometrical shapes that gradually lose all form and understanding. And when I find a student doing that, I say, "Are you doodling?" And of course they freak out. And they say, no, I was listening. And I tell them, no, I love doodling. Doodling is fantastic. I'm fascinated by doodling because everyone does it. People do it at weddings and funerals, in my classroom. And half the time they don't know they're doing it. What is strange about doodling is it captures something about the human mind. That we are built to create. We are built to express. We are built to project part of ourselves in the world around us. And it's evident in the grand scale of a Great Wall of China, and it's evident in doodling. It's evident in a starving artist, like Van Gogh, when he was starving and a neighbor brought him some money to eat. He was starving, and he took the money and bought more canvas and paint. Supposedly that is the greatest obsession and need of a human, is to feed themselves. And yet this person bought more canvas and paint. So the question is, what are we really? See, what the book argues is that we cannot actually answer that question of what free speech is without deciding what it is to us and without deciding who we are. Now, the fact is that we are hardwired for speech. Studies have shown that people who do not speak physically change. People who are isolated, explorers, prisoners, their brains actually shrink. Part of the hippocampus changes for failure to use something that we are hardwired to do, that is to speak. So if we are trying to figure out what we are, then we can't look at things like DNA, right? DNA gives us part of that answer, but it doesn't help us much. After all, 98% of our DNA is the same as great apes. 98%. We have a 65% overlap with a fruit fly. And we have a 60% overlap with that. So does that make us sort of bananas 2.0 or talking bananas? The answer is, of course, not. So the question then is, if we're something else than the parts that we are made of, including genetic parts, what really are we? Now, we've learned a lot, often by accident. This is a picture of Phineas Gage, who taught us a lot about the human brain by blowing part of it away. Phineas Gage was a railroad tapper who used to drill a hole in the rock face. He was a supervisor, and he would stuff it with dynamite, and then he would take a tamping iron, actually that tamping iron, and he would tamp it down, and then he would set it off, and he would blow the rock face. On this occasion, though, he was sloppy, and he sparked the rock, and it blew that tamping iron right through his head. And it blew away the front of his brain. And then this doctor came up with a truly brilliant thought. He said, we have no idea at that time what the front of the brain did. There's no way for us to know, except we know that he doesn't have one. Not anymore, at least not a complete one. So he decided if he watched how he changed, it might tell us what the front of the human brain does. And what he found was that Phineas Gage could do everything. Walk, talk, do mathematics. The only change that his friends reported, and they used the same term, is they said that Phineas Gage became an animal. They said that he had changed his personality. He was quick to anger. He was violent. He seemed incapable of having a relationship. He seemed frustrated with anything that was abstract. And of course, now we know that what he blew away with that iron was the part of the brain that allows us to do abstract thought, allows us to speak, allows us to project ourselves in the world around us. And when Phineas Gage lost it, he became more like an animal. That brings us back to Louis Brandeis's case and this woman. Now, Charlotte Anita Whitney was an incredibly brave person. George Bernard Shaw once said that unreasonable people expect the world to yield to them. And he said that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. She was a wonderfully unreasonable person. She was one of the early communists in the United States. She's one of the heroes of my book. She refused to shut up. She was actually coming from a very privileged family, and she went to a settlement in New York and saw poverty and suffering like she had never seen before, and she wanted to do something about it. And so she became a communist, and she fought for women's rights in California, and she fought against lynchings. And it was at one of those speeches that she was told if she spoke against lynching again, she would be arrested. And that is exactly what she did. She went on the stage and gave that speech, and she was arrested. And ultimately, her case went in front of the greatest civil libertarian in the history of the United States, Louis Brandeis, and he sent her to jail. Now, the strange thing about this is that the United States began with a moment of true revolutionary clarity. These words had never been written like that before. Even when the Marquis de Lafayette went to the French Revolution, he essentially tried to replicate the First Amendment, but then added at the end that you have a freedom of speech, essentially, so long as it's in conformity with national law, which, of course, defeats the purpose. He put a comma where the First Amendment put a period. The fact is, this is the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution. It came from nowhere. Most of the U.S. Constitution actually came from various British traditions. The framers liked the British legal system. They just didn't like what it did. But there was no corollary on free speech. The British never did protect free speech. They still don't. This was a unique moment. And some, like Hugo Black, said, you know, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging. He took a very literal concept of free speech, although you can question whether he stuck with it. But what happened after that moment of clarity, the combination of natural law and the First Amendment, was quickly lost. It was lost by, first and foremost, the greatest hypocrite that the White House has ever seen. You could make an argument about that. I haven't liked a president since James Madison, but I have a particular dislike for John Adams. And John Adams became everything that he fought against the revolution. And he essentially returned the country to a Blackstonian or English approach to free speech. And much of my book talks about that. Is what I call a functionalist view of free speech, which also happens to be the view in many European countries. The idea is that we protect free speech because it's good for democracy. And it certainly is. It's just much more than that. But the problem is when we went from an autonomous or natural rights view of free speech to a functionalist view of free speech, it allowed for endless trade-offs. You could decide some speech is good speech and some speech is bad speech. Some speech is good for democracy and some speech is not good for democracy. And you find yourself on a slippery slope. Europe has found itself at the very base of that mountain. It has gone on that slippery slope to the absolute bottom. Free speech is in a free fall in Europe, and it's a disgrace. And the problem is it's beginning to affect the United States, and we have people in the United States that want to follow the European example. And that's what this fight is all about. Now, it's a fight that actually continues and has always continued in the United States about what free speech is. I'm in the minority among law professors. Most law professors are positivists. They believe that rights have meaning and legitimacy because they are created through a legitimate legislative process. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who voted on the Whitney case, was the ultimate positivist. I believe that's what destroyed his legacy. He did not believe in any transcendent right. He didn't believe in anything that belongs to human beings because they are human. Now, one person that sort of understood it in a strange way was Norman Rockwell. Who painted that? See, when we went into World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave a speech called The Four Freedoms about what we were going to fight in Europe about. Rockwell was so taken by that, he told the White House he wanted to paint them. He was the most popular painter of that time. And they were waiting with great eagerness. And he finally sent them that. And I have to say, the White House was not thrilled. They said, what the hell is that? Or more importantly, who the hell is that? And then they were sort of expecting George Washington going over the Delaware, something like that. And he said, that's my neighbor, Jim Egerton. See, Rockwell had gone to a meeting in Vermont, a small town in Vermont, and they had decided that they were going to build a new school, and everyone was overjoyed. And then one man stood up, Jim Egerton, and he said, How are we going to pay for it? He said, I'm a dairy farmer, and I'm going to lose my farm because I can't pay any more taxes. And many people in this room will lose their farms. How are we going to pay for this? And Rockwell was so amazed about this moment. He said, that's what free speech is. Sometimes it's more important when you use it with your friends than with your enemies. And he did this, and it became the most popular war bonds poster in World War II. Because even though the White House didn't get it, the American people did. They knew exactly what that was. They had no idea who he was. They had no idea what he was talking about. But they knew exactly what he represented. He represented a natural right for all of them to speak their mind. Now, some people really hated that, hated Rockwell. When he was painting, there was a critic for the New Yorker who despised Rockwell. His name was Greenberg, Clement Greenberg. And he had taken the credit for discovering Jackson Pollock. And he had taken the credit for starting the interest in abstract art in the United States. And he said, this is not art. He said, this is kitsch. This is childish. He said, quote, this is an artist who's chosen not to be taken seriously. Rockwell didn't respond. He rarely responded until he did. He probably responded with the greatest takedown, the most devastating rebuttal in the history of art. Rockwell painted this. Now, that's called The Connoisseur. And the strange thing is, it's the only Rockwell painting where the main character cannot be seen from the front. And yet you sort of get an idea of what he looks like. You get the feeling he's been there a while from the art catalog that's tight in his hands. You get the feeling that he's trying to find meaning in this abstract painting. Now, in the audience was de Kooning, and also was Clement Greenberg. And when they unveiled this, de Kooning supposedly jumped up and said, my God, that's better than Pollock. And made critics go and take a close look at it and said, that's the finest abstract art I have seen in years. The point is, Rockwell could do that. He was a remarkably talented artist. He just didn't want to. I read an interview towards the end of his life when he was asked a wonderful question by a young reporter. And the question was simply, why do you paint like that? It was an amazingly brilliant question. And it elicited the single best answer that Rockwell ever gave in an interview. And he said, because when I was going to art schools, and he went to all the great art schools, he said, I traveled through the United States, and I saw things that a lot of my friends didn't see. Profound things, little things, that I wanted to paint. See, Rockwell wasn't simplistic. He was incredibly profound. He took simple things and conveyed meaning, layers of meaning that people understood more than any other artist of his time. Now, in the United States and in Europe, we have our own connoisseurs, legal connoisseurs. And the legal connoisseurs say something like this: free speech can't mean what the First Amendment says or what Turley says or what anyone says. It can't be abstract. It can't be that simple. It has to be something that is explained to you by the Clement Greenbergs of the law. It's something that many people don't agree with. They do think that free speech has an inherent natural meaning. Now, my book's subtitle is Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And the book talks about the many ages of rage that we have gone through. This isn't our first. It may be our most dangerous. What happened with Charlie is the ultimate escalation of an age of rage, when rage rhetoric becomes rageful action. But rage, as I talk about in the book, is a strange thing. It gives you a license to do things that you would never say or do. And what people won't admit is they like it. They won't admit it's addictive. And it is, and it's contagious. It can rob someone of all humanity, where they can look at someone like Charlie and not see the father of two, or a husband, or someone who has argued for free speech, and not see a person at all. That's what rage does. But we don't have to, in my view, fear the rage as much as the response. I am a big critic of the EU. And I'm a big critic of many of the European countries' approach to free speech. I believe Europe shows exactly what is awaiting for us in the United States if we go down this road. But we have to have a dialogue. But the problem with Europe is that every time there is violence, they use it as another reason to restrict free speech. When I spoke in Berlin at the World Forum about a year ago, it was right after Vance's speech in Munich, and the EU people were pretty pissed off. They were red hot. I was only one of two free speech people that were speaking that day. The other one is familiar to you, Nadine Straussen. And I remember one of the EU people and I had a sharp exchange. And it was a German delegate. And I said, you know, I'm so glad the forum this year is in Berlin. Because how is it going for you? Maybe you can tell me. Because every night I turn on the TV and skinheads and Nazis are marching by the thousands. They are having a banner year. You haven't done a thing. But a poll shows that only 17% of Germans feel comfortable speaking in public. That's how it's going. You silenced the wrong people. And now you want more. Right? Because it's not working. Because the fact is, it can't work. I have a book coming out. This is not a plug, I promise. Called Rage in the Republic. And it is Simon Schuster's book for the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration. Half of the book looks back at a comparison of the American and French revolutions, and then the other half looks forward at robotics, AI, and whether democracy can survive in the 21st century. I'll tell you in advance, I'm not optimistic about Europe. I honestly believe that democracy will have a very hard time in Europe because of the EU. I think it'll collapse. I think our democracy might collapse because we've never faced what we're about to face. We've never faced a huge population of unproductive people, people that will have to be supported by the state. But the book attempts to try to isolate what it is about democracies that can survive tests like the one we're about to face. When I was speaking recently in Denver, a woman came up to me. I was speaking about the Indispensable Right. And she said, I liked your book, but could you end on something positive? Which really broke my heart. I thought it was positive. And she was like, meh. I don't know if I can, I think the best I can offer, you know, one time they told Woody Allen, we'd like you to end your speech on something positive. And he said, have you not seen my movies? I don't do positive. So instead, he offered 2 negatives to make a positive. So I'm going to give you 2 negatives to make a positive. The first one is, it truly is not working. In the history of the world, not a single censorship system has ever succeeded. Not once. It has a total failure rate. It's never stopped in a single idea. It's never stopped a single movement. It is the most failed approach in human history. But it will never, ever stop having its advocates, like the EU. But it's not working. I've been corresponding closely. I just wrote a column in USA Today about my correspondence with Meta. Because over a year ago, the global head of Meta contacted me and said, we want to restore free speech protections. And I said, I got to tell you, I've been one of Zuckerberg's biggest critics. And I said, look, the free speech community is just not going to believe you. We have too much water under that bridge. So I'll give you a year, and you can show us that you're serious about restoring free speech. Well, the year came up last week, and I met with them again, and they showed me their data. And it's real. They essentially replicated the approach of X. And as of last week, they reduced censorship by 75%. What's interesting is they have not had an increase in violative speech. So that whole myth of the anti-free speech community, that if you don't censor everyone, there's going to be an explosion on the internet, is absolutely ridiculous. Here's your second negative. We're going to continue to hurt ourselves. We're going to continue to kill people like Charlie. He won't be the last. It's what we do. It's in our DNA. No, free speech isn't going to change that in us. But I guess it's the lesson of Pandora's box, which was really a jar. I don't know how it became a box. You know, if you remember, Zeus was really mad. Prometheus had given fire to humanity. So he tied Prometheus to the side of a mountain and had eagles pecking out his liver. That was all Prometheus. Prometheus was done. But he was still upset with humanity. And so he sent her. Maybe the first femme fatale. She's perfect. That's how she was created. She was created by Zeus. Perfect in every way. She was the perfect human. And in that jar, he put everything that would destroy humanity. But then the problem is that he made her too human, because she opened the jar. And out came everything. Greed and envy and hatred and pain. Everything we associate with humanity, it all came out. And it'll be with us. That's what happened to Charlie. It came out of the jar. But what people also don't talk about, and what I like to think about after finding out about the assassination, is the last thing that came out of the jar, and perhaps the thing that Zeus wanted least for humanity to receive. Supposedly the last thing out of the jar was hope. It's a strange thing why he'd want to keep that from humanity. And it's a strange thing to look at a friend like Charlie being gunned down and have any hope at all. But there is hope in free speech. More than on the other side. Free speech won't make us better people, but it's the only thing that has truly made a difference with bad speech. I admit I'm a dinosaur. I believe that the only solution to bad speech is good speech. But the things that defines us as a human being is that even after a tragedy like Charlie hurt, we have hope. And it comes a lot from our ability to speak, to project the best part of ourselves into the world around us, while others may be projecting the worst part of themselves. But I believe in the end, it's the hope that will make this a better world. Thank you very much.
I'm somewhat at a loss of words right now. Thank you for the lecture. We have a little bit of time for a couple of questions before we end.
Sure.
Well, thank you for the. I think those were the finishing words, weren't they? My question would be as follows: just leaving aside for a moment legal naturalism, legal positivism, and thinking about legal realism, which would be a very Rockwellian step, I think. And when I say legal realism, I mean the idea that law is not just what a couple of framers put in a constitution or judges put into a judgment, but it's also the real operation in the real world of people with power, authority, and the like. And if we look then from a legal realist point of view, I'm very interested by this idea that Europe is in free fall and indeed already at the bottom.
On free speech.
Yeah, I got it.
You're still doing great on soccer.
Yeah, I got it. Europe is at the very bottom. Where that leaves North Korea, I don't know, but never mind. Look, Europe is at the very bottom, which is interesting when we think that there is a president in office now who will use the power of the law to sue the Wall Street Journal, not following Europe in doing that. To sue CBS Broadcasting Company, not following Europe in doing that. If the fear was following Europe, will silence students, and on and on and on. I think there's a lot of space then at the bottom of that mountain, actually. I don't think Europe is lonely as...
I disagree.
I know.
Okay, can I respond?
Yeah, sure. As soon as I finish. Yeah. Okay. And, yeah, I mean, these are frontal assaults on free speech, which is not to say that Europe, it does not have problems. I think, Natalie and others have expressed them, and I largely agree that there are problems of free speech, particularly in the age of the internet, which no country on earth actually has well resolved. Every democracy certainly is struggling with free speech right now, and there is no perfect regime because the technology is evolving so quickly. But, so if Europe does indeed have problems, which every democracy has right now in the age of the internet, the problem still remains that this frontal, hideous attack on free speech that we're seeing in the United States is not following Europe in free fall. It is of its own.
Thank you. First of all, the examples you gave, I've criticized, as have many people in the free speech community. I mean it when I say I haven't liked a president since James Madison. We've never had a true ally in the White House. Has the Trump administration done some things that are good for free speech? You bet they have. But he's also done things that I've criticized, including those examples. I've written columns blasting those as unconstitutional. There's a big difference. No, we're not at the bottom with you. I'm afraid that's a little too convenient, because what Trump says doesn't make it the law. The difference is that in England and other countries in Europe, the courts have signed off on these things. In the United States, they have not. I wrote a column about just blasting President Trump about his flag burning column and said the only thing that gives me any sense of relief is that there's no way on earth that this will ever be used because the courts will not allow it. So our courts and our constitutional system have remained very faithful to free speech, unlike your own. As Natalie pointed out, European courts are signing off on these ridiculous definitions. Don't put us in the same group. We've got problems, brother, but they're not yours. But let me finish if I can. You give examples about legal realism and the favorite of talking about Donald Trump. I'm not afraid about free speech in the United States as much as I am in Europe. But let's talk about Europe. I'm not going to repeat what Natalie did in her wonderful presentation. I thought it was excellent. But let's take, for example, something near you. You had an English court a couple years ago uphold the conviction of a man who had racist and Nazi propaganda and items in his room. And the judge signed off on it and said that you're being convicted of what he called toxic ideologies, basically a thought crime. You've had people arrested in England for praying to themselves. But the biggest problem, as Natalie laid out rather well, is that you have standards in Europe and the EU, including the Digital Services Act, but also if you look at England, that are beyond any sense of definition. It allows them, as they have, to criminalize wider and wider arrays of speech, and it becomes insatiable. That's what England taught us, that once they started to censor people, they couldn't stop. But no, we're not at the bottom of that hill with you. We might get there, but we're not there yet.
I'll allow a quick reaction, and then we can continue it at the after party.
Yeah, well, thank you, James, for your response. The idea, it's only the president, it's not the courts. The whole point of these lawsuits is that they can't afford the courts. Again, I'm being a legal realist.
Wait, that's who can't afford the courts?
See, that's why they settled. That's why they were forced to settle, because nobody can afford this kind of litigation. So being a legal realist...
Wait, are you saying the American networks couldn't afford to litigate this case?
No, but generally, the law firms, all of this threat of lawfare...
The law firms did challenge.
This is the Singapore model of just make them broke.
The courts ruled for the law firms.
Moreover...
Trump lost in the courts against the law firms.
But,
they won.
But it still had the chilling effect. It still had the chilling effect.
Right, chilling effect, they won.
Because legal... Listen, okay. Moreover, but more importantly, if the concern here is with Europe, right? Okay, so I think we all agree, and I certainly agree. Just as you have criticized Trump, I and many others in the legal community in Britain have very much criticized some of the jurisprudence that you discuss, right? And I think we all agree on the kind of cases that Natalie was talking about. But have you also studied the cases where free speech has been upheld?
Yes.
Okay. Well. Okay. I'm so I'm sorry. The chasm is not really as great as you're making out. It is. It's quite great if we absolutize the ideological. But again, if we want to be legal realists, then we're not only talking ideology. We're talking about what is the actual speech that people have on the ground every day. And I don't think that this kind of transatlantic divide...
Really, you think that 17% of Germans feeling that they can speak freely about their views is just because the entire nation of Germany has lost their minds?
No, because I read that poll too, and actually it was much more qualified than that. And do you read the German press? I read the German press every day. And quite frankly, I do not see more freedom of speech in America. Far from it. You take any given day, look at all of the major German newspapers, of which there are far more, by the way, than major ones in the United States, which is a curious idea for a smaller country.
I'm really sorry to jump in,
okay,
but we haven't prepared for a debating format. But
this is free speech, and you compare the diversity of opinions, and then get back
we can do a debate impromptu at the after party. With stands,
okay.
we've got,
because I want to be a realist.
We've got podiums and everything, a timer. Thank you, thank you. All right. Sorry, do you want to react?
No.
Okay. There's... I will go to Tomáš because I ignored him last time. Sorry, Dan. And then we'll wrap it up. But it's...
Thank you. I would like to thank for the lecture, as it was truly magnificent. Alas, I am a European. Right, so I have two questions. I will try to be as quick as possible. The first one is that you argued that censorship has never worked. I would like to ask whether this is not a bit of a no true Scotsman or a no true communist kind of argument, because actually there hasn't been a society that would have absolute free speech. Every society at some level goes against speech when it is connected to action, which is demonstrably, which has demonstrable harm. I would argue that even in America, if you shout in a theater, fire,
oh,
fire,
God, don't use that line.
and a bunch of people get stampeded, like you probably wouldn't be for that. And the second one that actually follows on that is I'm a political science major, sadly, and so the way I understand policy making is that there are values that are compared, and we try to come to an outcome that leads to a common good, right? So there is privacy, there is like safety, utility, whatever, and we usually make these kinds of compromises, right? So if you're saying that that the freedom of speech is fundamental and should be basically absolute, as I understood it, right? You said that like when you say that there should be free speech, there shouldn't be any kind of infringement on that. Maybe I misunderstood.
No, I did not say that. In fact, my book says the opposite. That is.
Okay, then I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Then it's
so
irrelevant.
the book actually talks about many of the areas where we have limited free speech, and they include, you know, in fact, one of the successes of Facebook was to go back to year one and to go where we were, where there was not a lot of objection from the free speech community about removing criminal speech, fraud, things that are endangering children. There were some relatively clear lines. It was actually a very small percentage in comparison to what Facebook ended up doing. And also we have defamation that is obviously something that harms an individual. The reason I was rude enough when you mentioned fire in a crowded theaters, I have about 70 pages in the book on that line. And it is, in my view, the most unfortunate line ever written by a Supreme Court justice. It was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and it was written in the Schenck case. And it is repeated by the anti-free speech community like a mantra. And I was testifying in Congress once when one of the members said, Professor, you know that speech could be limited because you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. And I said, Congressman, you do realize where that line comes from, right? It comes from the Schenck case. It was used to imprison a socialist who had passed out a flyer opposing the draft by quoting the United States Constitution. That's Schenck. And you are relying on that line? And by the way, Oliver Wendell Holmes regretted it. And ultimately, the Supreme Court rejected Schenck. So it's not even a good case anymore. The fact is, I am not an absolutist. I admit that my natural default is with free speech. And I also certainly admit that, as you mentioned, the communist countries and restricting speech, they certainly did restrict a lot of speech. They imprisoned a lot of people. It didn't protect them from the arc of history. It didn't stop an idea. It didn't preserve them. They were relatively short in terms of the empires and history. That's what I mean. But no, I'm not an absolutist. But I do, and I'm also not sentimental about free speech. I honestly believe that free speech is our greatest defense against hate. And people use hate speech to limit free speech, but it's free speech that truly combats hate. It doesn't mean we'll get rid of it. We're not going to get rid of anti-Semitism or racism. That's in our DNA. But if you take a look at what free societies have done with hate, I believe it vindicates free speech.
Okay. Thank you. And we will have one last question before
that's not a question, that's just a reaction you refused. Germany is the country where 2,000 people were arrested for calling a politician a dick. This word. That's Germany. Even New York Times, hyper-progressive New York Times, acknowledged this and called this a problem. Germany has locks or does search of homes of people for saying something on Facebook that is perfectly legal. Germany is a country where secret services, offices in the magazines you mentioned that you read, they have secret service agents, and journalists are have to complain by law when secret service tells them to do something. That's Germany, by the way.
Right. Okay. Well, we can continue this debate later on at the symposium. Once again, thank you very much, Jonathan Turley. It was fantastic. And